No one, and I mean no one, would ever speak about SpongeBob in terms of arcs, because the show makes most of their episodes work in any order. But the writers have cleverly woven together an arc right in front of our faces, that up to the point in this video, has ended with quite the drama. As most of us know, Mr. Krabs is the proud owner of the dusty old burger joint turned fast food icon, the Krusty Krab. Mrs. Puff is the proud owner and teacher of her own boating school, of which our titular character is the only one who hasn't passed the test fully. Given how much time he spent between these two people, they were bound to meet, and their first few interactions didn't give any indication of anything deeper than friendliness. One of the earliest times we'd see Mr. Krabs and Mrs. Puff together is within the ending of Texas, where SpongeBob assembled a going away party and we'd see Mrs. Puff behind Mr. Krabs in a non-speaking cameo. He'd also claimed to have received a gift from her when SpongeBob mentions all of the items Mr. Krabs has that he appears to have stolen within Life of Crime. But the real start to their relationship happens within the season 2 episode, Krusty Love.
Hey, that's my driving teacher, Mrs. Puff.
Mrs. Puff? Oh, she's married.
Oh no, Mr. Krabs, she's single.
And with SpongeBob's seemingly small bit of info, an arrow was shot through Eugene's heart. Up to this point in the series, Mr. Krabs has had an incredible range, from the morally gray father figure mentor, to adversary of longtime rival Plankton, to even money-hungry, comedically capitalistic buffoon. However, he has yet to be this vulnerable about someone, which brought forth a unique dynamic for Mr. Krabs that even Plankton and Karen couldn't claim to have. You can see how SpongeBob's dynamic with both of them has him as somewhat a burden to them both, and this is best seen in how neither of them openly wants to meet each other, but SpongeBob pushes them together anyway. So one of the knee-jerk reactions to claiming that a show like SpongeBob has romance is to say that it's just a silly comedy show, and that person would be right, except it makes a bad assumption. Yes, generally when we see romance play out in animated media, typically the ones most spoken about are the ones that treat that pairing seriously. However, there is nothing stopping a show from treating a romantic pairing completely comedically, and that's what this episode aimed to do. You see it in how Mr. Krabs can barely utter a word in front of Mrs. Puff, greatly exaggerating and poking fun at the notion of being nervous in front of someone that you like. They keep it light and comedic because the show is light and comedic, but the pairing is real.
Is that true, Mr. Krabs? Do you want to take me on a date?
What do you say?
What do I say? I say you have a way with words, Mr. Krabs.
The date is set, and Mr. Krabs takes Mrs. Puff to one of the finest establishments in the Bikini Bottom, which doesn't get spoken about as quite the memorable location. He spares literally no expense for her on the first date, which I don't know if that's the best idea to do, but in hindsight, it set off a good first impression. The 5-star meal, foot rubs in between meals, imported music, caricatures, limousine services, all amount to the grossly high $100,000. And it shows you who Mr. Krabs is, the same man who sold SpongeBob's soul, his top earning employee, for 62 cents. He, like many people, like many characters, completely switches up around women. Being cheap is one of his core sentiments, and seeing him splurge can mean different things to different people. Some people may view this as acting out of character and using money to expedite the courting process, and others may view it as genuine affection, given that he's willing to do the one thing that he doesn't even really do for his daughter. All we know now is that SpongeBob will be in charge of reining in Mr. Krabs from spending too much money on Mrs. Puff. This leads to one of the most memorable jokes in the series, and the underlying problem that this dynamic sets up.
Go get flowers!
But you said—
SpongeBob! You can't call on a classy lady like Mrs. Puff empty-handed. We ain't talking about this. Or this. We're talking about this.
Almost ready.
Hurry, boy! Get the flowers!
The problem is that SpongeBob sees Mr. Krabs as his boss, even during his off hours. Beyond that, SpongeBob sees Mr. Krabs as something in the area of a father figure, at least at this time, and values his perspective and authority. So to tell Mr. Krabs no during such an emotionally intense time would prove harder than anticipated, especially because even though Mr. Krabs is stuck between his love of money and his infatuation for Mrs. Puff, SpongeBob is caught between wanting to obey Mr. Krabs' orders in a moment of sobriety, and not wanting to be responsible for the collapse of the newly made relationship between two people he respects a lot. So of course, it is a disaster, as Mr. Krabs says one thing, but demands another, and SpongeBob, who already is the most experienced when it comes to social cues, takes all of the abuse. However, unlike modern day SpongeBob, we see a range of emotions, from the happiness that he has for his boss finding love, sympathy for his boss's struggle to not spend money over her, confusion over Mr. Krabs' constant switch-ups, nervousness in trying to confront Mr. Krabs during his episodes, and now, frustration.
Aren't you supposed to be saving me money?
I'm trying, Mr. Krabs, but you keep telling me to buy things for Mrs. Puff. It's all really confusing.
One of the biggest advantages a serialized show has over more plot-driven shows is that they can play loose with its consistency. It would have been annoying to see Mr. Krabs in this state of mind for multiple episodes. Just look at regular show if you want to see the way a character can behave in two totally different mindsets depending on if a girl is present or not. However, for one episode, this behavior works, and it's interesting to see, especially because at this rate, SpongeBob was going to run out of emotions to hold back as Mr. Krabs blames SpongeBob again for spending his money, despite SpongeBob calling that behavior out.
Well, Mr. Krabs, do you want to know what I think? Oh, Rugga, Bleep, Brugga, Smolin, Holland, Mr. Krabs, Yugga, Hugga, Mergan, Wallet, Zippy, Bibby, Spin, Ribby, Libby, Jibba, Shibba, Mr. Krabs' wallet!
You will never see SpongeBob like that again. Yes, he does have outbursts, but they're usually portrayed as over-the-top cartoony to not bring the mood of the episode down. Here, that's not the case. The team wants you to feel the gravity of SpongeBob blowing up the way that he did, even in how SpongeBob is portrayed to be realistically upset, rather than comedically upset, showing the range of emotions that he used to have. Obviously, anger isn't exactly the most marketable emotion to sell in a kid's show, but what made these moments special is that they were both rare and deserved, especially after Mr. Krabs' conduct. So how did Mrs. Puff, who was in the background for most of this, react to this level of spoiling?
I just don't feel comfortable accepting all these gifts. I'd rather go Dutch, if you don't mind.
Okay.
You're a very sweet man, Mr. Krabs.
While Mrs. Puff and Mr. Krabs weren't exactly going out at this time, these next episodes would take a harsh turn from such a romantic first step. As we journey through the post-Krusty Love era, take note of how they treat each other, because the last episode in this era would break the lore as we know it. So you may think after this moment we'd get more teases of their dynamic together, and you'd be right. Oh wait, what's that? Sorry, I meant absolutely wrong. They went back to being friends, and in some episodes, even less than friends. Of the next times we see them together is a brief moment within Party Pooper Pants where SpongeBob gets locked out and they're seen dancing together. Now, I don't think that's meant to be a nod to Krusty Love, as Mrs. Puff also interacts with Patrick and Pearl, but it is nice to think that it was. However, within SpongeBob Meets the Strangler, when SpongeBob reaches his home, he is surprised that there's another party where Mr. Krabs and Mrs. Puff are dancing around each other again. And again, I'd like to think it's coincidental, but they could have been anywhere in the room, and yet the team is pairing them up quite often. Fast forward many episodes, and within the Krabby Chronicle, Mr. Krabs would get the idea to run a newspaper centered on gossip, and guess who he decided to make one of his victims?
Boating teacher in high-speed chase! I think you've finally done it, boy! You've given me a story that'll sell!
Now, I wouldn't approve of my partner or my crush getting dragged in a newspaper, but here we can safely assume that they aren't a couple. Like I said before, Mr. Krabs isn't above stepping on the people he cares about to make $1. Or 62 cents. Mrs. Puff would lose her boating school within this episode, showing that Mr. Krabs is out of his honeymoon period with Mrs. Puff and will treat her like any other person. This goes both ways, where Mrs. Puff would not hold back in treating Mr. Krabs like any other person within the episode Growth Spout. Mr. Krabs, desperate to feed his growing daughter, would invade Mrs. Puff's garden, only to learn that the peanuts she appeared to be growing were animals, leading to a tricky escape.
Who's there? I'm warning you. I have a blunt instrument here and I'm not afraid to use it. There you are, sucker!
However, in all 4 episodes, their interactions were minor or indirect. It isn't until Summer Job where we would see them not only interact, but acknowledge the events of Krusty Love. So Mrs. Puff, who has 2 lifetimes worth of sponge-related PTSD, mistakenly crashes into the Krusty Krab and doesn't have the finances to cover the costs. This leads into an interesting line of questions.
I think we can work something out.
Huh? You mean we should go out on a date?
Interesting. No, I had something else in mind.
This is a stark contrast to the crab who couldn't even speak to Mrs. Puff, let alone think of rejecting a date with her. While I think this is just a side effect of making a serialized show, allow me to introduce a different phenomena that happens often in shows. Most of us know Steven Hillenburg, the creator of SpongeBob SquarePants, but more importantly, the showrunner from seasons 1 to 3. Now, after stepping down from this role, Paul Tibbitt would spearhead showrunning until around season 9. I'm sure the team had close contact with Hillenburg during the post-movie era, as Hillenburg was often credited as an executive producer, and many people who worked on the show at this time report to have a good relationship with him. However, unconsciously, when introducing a new or a different person at the forefront of a show, there's a lot of small, intangible aspects about the show that will change. Things that don't mean a lot when you censor in on them, but when you add all of these changes up, create a different feel for the show. This is why people typically separate SpongeBob into 3 parts, which roughly equal the different showrunners for the show. I couldn't tell you if Hillenburg would have acknowledged the events of Krusty Love if he had the chance to make another Mr. Krabs and Mrs. Puff centric episode, but I can say the team underneath Paul Tibbitt didn't wish to portray them like that, which is valid. Summer Job is largely an episode where SpongeBob drives Mrs. Puff crazy. Mrs. Puff tries to hold herself together knowing that the alternative is jail time. So yes, it's one of those episodes.
This is just ridiculous. Would you simply explain my duties, please?
What are you doing yelling at me, customers? The Duke here is one of me regulars, and I don't need to explain what happens when you start losing your regularity, do I?
Oh dear. Message received, Mr. Krabs.
Just don't let it happen again.
This is the same guy who couldn't go 5 seconds without spending money on her. It's a completely different Mr. Krabs, and you can even assume at this time, he probably didn't even see her as a friend if the prior episodes mean anything. She'd crack and be sent to jail, proving to be a very rough time for her between this episode and the Krabby Chronicle. The next 2 episodes are quite minor, but display a similar pattern. Mr. Krabs flat out steals Mrs. Puff's boating school bus with no remorse within Hello Bikini Bottom.
Oh, whew. Changing the oil in the school busmobile sure is a pain in the... What the...
Stop! Thief!
Mr. Krabs would also flat out attempt to undermine Mrs. Puff's teaching abilities, undercut her business, and basically trash her profession, all at the same time within Tutor Sauce.
Are you sure about this, Mr. Krabs?
Why, I couldn't be surer, lad. You don't need a professional to teach you how to drive.
You know, Mr. Krabs, at boating school, Mrs.
Wipe that boating school malarkey out of your mind, son. It's all a racket.
It is?
And that goes for every kind of schooling.
Although they do not interact within this episode, he is seen in her boating school towards the end as a consequence of his actions. Before we get to the last episode and the pre-relationship era post-Krusty Love, we must speak about Married to Money. It is another Plankton disguises himself to steal the formula type episode, but this one is a bit different when viewed in this context. While Mr. Krabs is no stranger to love, outside of Mrs. Puff, given that he fell for Patrick wearing a different outfit, they take that concept to a new height in this episode, featuring aspects such as integrating what Mr. Krabs thought was a new woman not only into his personal life, but family life. Mr. Krabs was so serious that he proposed to this woman. Now, surely they wouldn't do something so heinous as invite Mrs. Puff to this wedding, surely. Oh, they did? I'm sure it's a coincidence. Now, it would be really wild if she were to say, I don't know, try to catch the traditional bouquet and be very upset that she didn't, right? Again, this was the same person who was head over heels for her. Now you might say, oh Jay, people can get over the person that they used to love just because you saw one episode with them entertaining the idea. You shouldn't get attached to it. You shouldn't stoop down to the levels of hopeless romantic shippers who look for any pairing and write countless Wattpad level fan fictions about them. Geez, you act like they've been dating for the last 16 years or something.
Mrs. Mrs. Puff, we've been dating for 16 years now, so I was sincerely hoping that today might finally be the day that...
Yes, Eugene?
That I steal a little kiss?
Oh, Eugene.
So, this is Whirly Brains, and it confirms that Mr. Krabs and Mrs. Puff have been dating for the last 16 years. For those curious, this episode was released in 2016, so 16 years lands on the year 2000, 2 years before the premiere of Krusty Love, but it is the same year that the episode Texas was released, one of the first times that we would see this pair together on screen. The biggest sentiment expressed towards SpongeBob lore is that it is in a vacuum, and that you should not treat any canon that it may imply seriously. Even the writers have equated canon to a dusty jar in the corner. However, this episode is a counter-argument to that sentiment, because from this point, nearly every single episode would acknowledge their relationship in a way that episodes prior to Whirly Brains and post Krusty Love would act as if they had no chemistry with each other. This basically implies a timeline, and I don't understand why a show like SpongeBob would treat a timeline as this dirty word. Plenty of episodic shows have acknowledged a timeline, even if it wasn't explicit. Fairly OddParents had a clear timeline when it came to Remy Bucksaplenty-esque episodes. Johnny Test had plenty of episodes that were built off of prior episodes. The Amazing World of Gumball clearly has a distinction of how Gumball treats Penny pre and post the shell. A timeline doesn't have to be explicit in the way that a plot-driven show would build a clear beginning and end. There can just be things that weren't acknowledged before and are acknowledged after, and Mr. Krabs and Mrs. Puff's relationship is a big reason why I believe there is a timeline, even if it isn't a clear one. So now I introduce you to the post-Whirly Brain episodes, where you can see for yourself how Mr. Krabs and Mrs. Puff treats each other. Within the post-Whirly Brain episodes, which I'll just call the relationship episodes, it is split between two eras, arbitrarily. The honeymoon era and the comfort era. Just 2 points, again arbitrary, where you can tell where the writing team was introducing the concept as a recurring theme, and when the team got more comfortable using their dynamic in other ways. We start things off with Pharaoh Friends, an episode I covered a long time ago. Within that episode, Neptune's moon turns all of the sea creatures feral, and within that episode, not only do we have Mr. Krabs and Mrs. Puff acting like a couple after Whirly Brains, but we even get on-screen moments of them.
Get away from the light! The light is bad! Run for the shade!
So romantic.
Oh,
Eugenikins, give me some sugar.
I'm always a sucker for a good smooch.
Similarly to Whirly Brains, their dynamic is always kept quite comedic, as that's what the show has always been. It would prove to be an interesting challenge to find ways to progress their dynamic without changing what the show wants to do at its core. Sometimes, such as in Spot Returns or Plankton's old chum, it is very subtle, such as Mrs. Puff having a photo of Mr. Krabs within her home. Other times, they continue to acknowledge the relationship, such as in Teacher's Pests, where after trashing her boating school again, she has to rein him in alongside Plankton.
Oh, my classroom! Stop!
Ooh, sorry, cutie.
Suck up.
Oh, it's on.
Oh, bring it!
Oh, I said knock it off. Now don't make me get rough.
Brass knuckles, huh? Respect.
It is tiny gestures like this that prove that the show can build on things without having to dedicate multiple episodes solely for the purpose of developing this dynamic. More often than not, if someone enjoys seeing two people together, so long as you're not undermining the reason people enjoy their dynamic or their characters individually, you don't need to do that much, especially if the viewer knows that the show is episodic. In fact, most of the time we'll see them together will be minor moments, such as Plankton Paranoia, an episode where Mr. Krabs would get increasingly anxious about Plankton's next attempt to steal the Krabby Patty formula, that he would go to conspiratorial methods to keep it safe, including not trusting his own girlfriend. Or it would be indirect through episodes like Girls Night Out, where in an attempt to prank Plankton, Mrs. Puff and Sandy would dress as Mr. Krabs, roping the duo into an elaborate setup. However, you would get that special episode where they'd actually acknowledge the shakiness of their relationship, as in My Two Krabses, where SpongeBob, in an attempt to keep the relationship between two people he respects a lot afloat, unintentionally creates more conflict for them to deal with. Mr. Krabs tans to get ready for his date with Mrs. Puff, and in the process gets his shell stolen by SpongeBob, who thinks that he melted. In creating a new Mr. Krabs and training him to act just like Mr. Krabs, Mrs. Puff is none the wiser. This leads into the original Mr. Krabs fighting for his lady's honor.
Get your mitt off me, gal bucko!
Oh! You're not going to take that from a stranger, are you, Eugene? Fight for my...
Wow,
Mr. Krabs, despite being in the right, decides to fight the imitator because of the sheer thought of seeing Mrs. Puff with anyone else. More on that later. As we enter these new episodes in the Comfort era, you'll see that it goes from comedic romantic to just comedic, as new viewers should be expected to know that they are an official couple. The first episode to kick that off is the previously banned Quarantine Crab, where Mr. Krabs will get paranoid and lock up everyone he's suspected of having clam flu. There isn't really much to Krabs and Puff's dynamic here, except for that once she's on the side of SpongeBob, which is kinda crazy, when it comes to detaining a crazy person, justifiably. That crazy person being Mr. Krabs. So again, we're getting episodes where they're completely comfortable and grounded with each other. Their dynamic doesn't stop within the original show. Within Camp Coral, Mrs. Puff would be a camp counselor, one of Mr. Krabs' right-hand people.
Now, campers, does everyone have their travel buddies?
We got our buddies!
However, after watching plenty of episodes such as Camp SpongeBob, as the clip showed there, the show largely treats their relationship as a work relationship, which I think is more than fine for what that particular show wants to achieve. And even still in this Comfort era, there are plenty of episodes that have them interact either indirectly or in a minor way, such as Lighthouse Louie, where after SpongeBob inadvertently destroys the town with Mrs. Puff's lighthouse, of all things, she gets the blame from that, including from Mr. Krabs, or in Knock Knock Who's There, where we see her likeness in a music box of Mr. Krabs' possession. However, there are a few episodes that test their relationship, such as Cookie Cooks, where Mr. Krabs makes the exact same mistake he's made in Krusty Love and bring Mrs. Puff to the exact same expensive restaurant that drained his bank account before. Except this time, rather than footing the bill reluctantly, he tries multiple angles of getting out of paying for it to begin with, none of which work and only results in an angry Puff.
Once again, you ruined our whole evening by being cheap. I thought you cared about me.
I do. I'll make it up to you, honey biscuit. Tomorrow night at my house, we'll have the most romantical and fancy type meal you ever tasted.
As you can tell, the relationship is quite even, as there's plenty of episodes I've mentioned before, such as Quarantine Crab or Plankton Paranoia, where Mr. Krabs is the one causing mayhem, but there's plenty of episodes where Mrs. Puff puts her foot down, Mr. Krabs, doubling down on being cheap, exploits his workers and his daughter to create the best date for Mrs. Puff, not even realizing that there's too many scenarios for this to go wrong, including Mrs. Puff getting too impatient to eat and simply indiscriminately eating whatever is in front of her out of spite.
Just let me check the quality, my dear.
Let go of my grab, Bob. I'm famished. That's not food. That's SpongeBob.
Oftentimes, we see Mrs. Puff as the butt of the joke, especially in boarding school-centric episodes, so to have her as the aggressor and the one to fear was a great change and one of the recent examples of how our character has progressed from the earlier seasons. Within There Will Be Grease, she appears more so as a running joke of Mr. Krabs selling grease to her in an attempt to change her appearance, with her being offended but taking a bottle or two just to be sure.
And even cover up those maturation lines around your eyes.
How dare you? Give me 10 bottles.
There's also the minor appearance in Hiccup Plague, where she grabs a bite to eat at the Krusty Krab and interacts with Mr. Krabs in the process. And within Ride Patrick Ride, we get to see Mr. Krabs both witness and experience the road-related chaos that Mrs. Puff witnesses and experiences on a regular basis with SpongeBob, but more so Patrick, crashing their bike into the bike that Mr. Krabs and Mrs. Puff were riding. This is because SpongeBob is trying to teach Patrick how to ride a bike, which is a fun premise given that SpongeBob sometimes rides a unicycle. After SpongeBob inquires if Mrs. Puff has ever had to teach a student that was hard to teach, Mrs. Puff swallows her anger and simply tells SpongeBob that some people are unteachable, leading to this hilarious exchange.
Thanks, Mrs. Bob.
We're having our next date at home.
So you've seen it all, from episodes that depict their relationship as the main aspect of the episode, episodes that keep subtle hints in the background, episodes that have them on screen but don't highlight their relationship. What else is there left to explore? What about drama? Yes, they actually decide to throw in some drama within SpongeBob. Remember My Two Krabses and how they'd introduced the concept of Mr. Krabs being possessive over Mrs. Puff? Imagine my surprise watching Buff for Puff, an episode in which after Larry saves Mr. Krabs from drowning, Mrs. Puff rewards Larry with a kiss on the cheek, and Mr. Krabs does not like that at all.
Thanks again.
Larry's always ready to step in.
This leads into Mr. Krabs getting jealous, and the jealousy here versus an episode like My Two Krabses is a bit more palpable because Larry is a real recurring character. Despite being a show that's been on for years, Larry and Mr. Krabs don't have that many moments together compared to practically any other regularly occurring character, so there is this element of distance between them. Plus, it's just funny to see Mr. Krabs in this jealous, vulnerable state over Larry doing his job. He equates Mrs. Puff's gratitude to her apparently wanting muscle-bound men over him, which we know isn't true, but that isn't gonna stop him. He goes to the house of the enemy, Larry's gym, and despite putting in over 100 hours of exercise, he looks exactly the same. So he does the next best thing.
Hey there, ma'am. Is this beach taken?
Oh my, Eugene, you're so well-defined.
It shows you that Mr. Krabs truly hasn't evolved from his days of crusty love decades ago, and is still doing many things to impress Mrs. Puff that are all either redundant or not viewed as such an important detail. And in this case, it actually works against him, because once Mrs. Puff learns that Mr. Krabs stole Larry's shell, get this, Mrs. Puff decides to take Larry on a date.
I like my boys a little soft around the edges. That's why Larry and I have a beach date tomorrow.
Haha, Larry loves beach dates.
If you were to tell me that this would be a scene in a SpongeBob episode, I would have called you crazy because this is still SpongeBob, a comedic, silly episodic show. But they're adding in these scenes and chaining it in a way where they do want you to remember these aspects about these characters. If they didn't, then many of these episodes should have followed what the episodes after Krusty Love were. Episodes where Mrs. Puff and Mr. Krabs didn't know each other. The reason I say this is hidden in plain sight isn't because I believe the writers are trying to hide this grand arc, but to highlight that in our community, you would never see these two spoken about and highlighted in the same way that we would speak about dynamics in other shows, because SpongeBob has always had this label of everything being in a vacuum. And I feel like you can't say that here because there were episodes where they weren't a couple, then there was an episode that acknowledged them as a couple, and then every episode after that had them act as if they were a couple. It wouldn't be spoken about in the way that we speak about Mordecai and Margaret, Luz and Amity, or even Aang and Katara, but it is a real relationship, and I cannot wait to see all of the silly adventures they go on next. Mrs. Puff has had such a golden era in this newer section of the show, and if you haven't checked it out, you should check out when she visits a legendary salty spittoon in this episode here.